Okay, welcome back. Welcome to Unit 8. And Unit 8, we start with a discussion of Romanticism. So, if you remember our last art historical lecture, we talked about the transition from the late Baroque all the way to Neoclassicism and to the Age of Enlightenment. And so here we're going from Neoclassicism to Romanticism. We will also talk a little bit about realism, but we'll talk about that mostly in the next unit. And one of the things, if you remember from the last art historical lecture, we talked about how in the period of from the late Baroque, especially into the Rococo, we saw some trends, some things that were established that I mentioned were going to be trends that we were going to see over and over again through the 19th century and into the 20th century. And we see some of those trends, like such as the sort of the antagonistic attitude between painterly, loose, expressionistic painterly painting versus painting that's tight and tied to really a tight and controlled line drawing. That kind of antagonism is going to continue through the Romantic period. Um, but we also will see some trends in the Romantic period, which will then be established and will be continuing sort of ideas through modernism in the 20th century and postmodernism. And to a certain degree, I like to tell my studio students that Romanticism isn't really dead. It's just has become kind of a sensibility that lingers with us, even though the Romantic period is long gone. I meet young Romanticists all the time, far more of them than young modernists for that matter. And so another thing that's kind of that ties both what we started to see in the previous period, in the from the late Baroque um, uh, to the Age of Enlightenment, and then in this period, another thing that ties these two together is that we're starting to see art movements become conscious decisions, things that groups of people or whole societies are aware of and think about, not so much as something that already happened, but as a decision or a set of decisions that artists are making in real time. So that, I mean, when we were thinking about the Rococo was viewed as a style, and to a certain degree and that as a style is therefore a choice. Whereas the styles of, the change of style in the early Renaissance compared to the Gothic was something that people only noticed when it was already long history ago. So with that, with the Rococo and then with Neoclassicism, we have this growing sense of art movements becoming less about just trends that happen as people, over long periods of time change their mind about what is aesthetic, to becoming decisions that are hotly debated within a society. So that's another major thing. So let's talk about what are some of the distinctive qualities of Romanticism. Romanticism is a really hard, especially when we're talking about visual art. It's a hard thing for students, especially young students, to understand because the visual art is so diverse. There's so many different works of art that I'm going to point out to you, and I'm going to say this is romantic and this is romantic, and you're going to look at them and you'll be like, but they don't look anything like each other. And that one of the things to remember is that in Romanticism, visual consistency and continuity was not that important. What was important was a consistency and continuity of subject matter and of ideas, of aesthetic ideas in terms of narrative and subject matter. And so um, one of the main things that ties a lot of Romantic art together is how Romanticism viewed the artist. They viewed the artist as kind of a radical individual, a person who was different from society because of their own abilities, their own sensibilities, and with those differences, that isolated the artist from society, and so that the artist was essentially in opposition to society, and vice versa. Society was in opposition to the artist. That the very things that tie society together, which is everyone agrees to conventional norms, right, are the things that the artist rebels against. And so the very things that make the artist interesting and special, right, are the things that make them also confrontational to society. Um, and so this is kind of a unifying theme, but there's other themes in, and we see this both in the lives of the actual romantic artists, as well as to a certain degree in terms of what kinds of narratives romantic artists. We definitely see this a lot more in romantic literature, but even in romantic visual art, we see this kind of occupation or preoccupation with the artist or with a hero as being this kind of a symbol of a radical individual. And other themes that kind of tie romantic art are interest in the tragic and especially the catastrophic. Romantic artists loved shipwrecks, right? Interest in the exotic and the erotic. They were much more interested in erotic themes if they could happen in faraway, strange places, you know, like in Turkey or in the far east. They were interested in the dark, the grotesque. This is where the invention of the horror story and the Gothic novel comes about. They were interested in kind of idealized and fantastical notions of the past or of even kind of fantastical other worlds. So this gives you kind of a sense of what kind of is going to tie romantic art together. The other thing I would say is that think of Romanticism as being a rejection of uh, the Enlightenment's kind of faith um, in rationalism and in reason, and instead is an embrace of emotionalism and of um, intuitive decision making and expression. Okay, so let's start looking at some art. So we saw hints of romantic art going way back into the Baroque period. If you remember, there was a landscape painting by Rembrandt that I showed you that was one of a number of Rembrandt landscape paintings that had this very kind of proto-romantic kind of vibe. But we also, late in the kind of the neoclassical and Age of Enlightenment period of art, we have these artists who are showing hints of what Romanticism might look like. So Goya is definitely one of them. Um, and but also in England, we have artists like William Blake, who both as a writer and as an artist was making artwork that was very kind of proto romantic. And Blake actually mostly made artwork as illustrations for his works, his literary works, and he primarily worked in printmaking. But he did a lot of work where he hand colored his prints, and so he would make both kind of printed editions of his poems and other literary works, where he would just have the prints, but then he would make handmade versions for himself and for his friends, where he would hand color and hand kind of embellish them. But they have this very kind of uh, a romantic spirit, an interest in the strange and unusual. And there was growing in England this kind of community of artists who are all strangely kind of proto-romantic. So Fuseli um, came from Switzerland, was also an artist with that kind of pre-romantic look. And this particular painting is sort of emblematic of the beginning of Romanticism in many art history textbooks. And I want to point out, I'm just about to run out of time, my timer is about to go off, that even with artists who we wouldn't think of as a whole as being romantic artists, let me turn that off, as being romantic artists, that we see these romantic trends. So here's Joseph Wright of Derby, who is certainly much more of a neoclassicist, or as I would say, he's an artist of the Enlightenment, an artist who really kind of embodied the Age of Enlightenment. But even here in a painting, he's showing a very kind of romantic sensibilities and interest in the mysterious and the dark. Anyway, okay, that's where part one is going to end. We'll probably have 4 parts for this lecture.